I want to begin by reading a small portion of a letter that I read a while back from a woman. I've been struggling with my faith for many years, and now I think I understand why. I was raised to believe that the more you do, the more you're worth. The better you behave, the more you're loved. From my parents to my spouse to God, I was confused and exhausted. In my world, perfection was the only option. And we all know that is a losing proposition. What we talk about here week in and week out is not just conceptual. It's really a matter of life and death. If love and approval and value and significance are things we must go out and earn ourselves, we will live enslavingly miserable lives. If our worth and our value is dependent on what we can accomplish, what we can do, who we can present ourselves to be to the people in our lives, we'll be miserable, enslavingly miserable. Grace is not just a concept. It's the difference between hope and despair. It's the difference between peace and misery. It's, as I said, the difference between life and death. Christianity, unlike religion, announces that God's love for us is a gift to be received, not a wage to be earned. It's a no strings attached present for the undeserving, not compensation for the worthy, for the person who deserves it. Robert Capon put it like this: grace is not a reward for hard work or good behavior. It is a lark, a joke, a hilariously inequitable generosity. It is, in a word, a gift. I love that, and that's absolutely true. Grace is not a reward for hard work or good behavior. It's a lark, a joke, a hilariously inequitable generosity. In other words, it's not fair. Grace is not fair. If the distribution of God's grace to us was based on fairness, we'd be screwed. Screwed. Because we don't deserve it. That's the definition of grace. It's undeserved favor. It's not love given to the lovable. It's love given to the unlovable. It's not love given to good people. It's love given to bad people. That's grace. That's what makes it so mind-blowing. That's what makes it so counterintuitive. Life without grace is death. You know that to be true. Where there is grace in your closest relationships, forgiveness, love, patience, mercy, those sorts of things, those relationships tend to be warm and intimate. But think about what a graceless relationship feels like. It's cold, it's divisive. It doesn't generate intimacy at all. It generates a desire to want to get away from that person, where there's a lot of scorekeeping and judgment and evaluation. Those aren't the kinds of people we're close with. Or if we are, we want to get away from them. So grace is really a matter of life and death. The presence of grace is life. The absence of grace is death. That's not just true in our relationship to God. That's true in our relationship to other people. And we see the beauty, the counterintuitive beauty of grace and the power of grace here in this well-known story of Zacchaeus. I mean, the familiarity of this story conjures up memories of coloring books and sing-alongs. I don't know if you grew up going to church or Sunday school, but this is a really well-known story, even if you didn't grow up going to church and going to Sunday school. I mean, we all know that Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he, and he really wanted to see Jesus, but he couldn't, so he climbed up a sycamore tree, okay? I mean, we know the songs, we've seen the skits, perhaps, in our Sunday school classes growing up. I don't know exactly why I was always chosen to be Zacchaeus, which seemed a little unfair to me. Wasn't really good for my self-image as a little boy. Nevertheless, so, I mean, the familiarity of this story it kind of conjures up memories of sing-alongs and coloring books and those sorts of things. But all silliness aside, this has to be one of the most jaw-dropping pictures of grace in the Bible. I love it. Absolutely love it. Stacy and I were talking about it yesterday morning. She's like, what are you preaching on? I said, I'm still figuring that out. But I said, I've been thinking this week that I want to preach on Zacchaeus. I've done it before, a while ago. But every time I go to a story that I have read before or a story, a passage in the Bible that I've preached from before, I always go back to it and I see something new. I learn something new. And whenever I see something new or learn something new, I want to share it with you. And I love this story. Absolutely love it. The story of Zacchaeus gives us a window into Jesus's unpopular love for sinners. It really shows us who Jesus is in a powerful way. It gives us a window into the fruit that grace can bear in a person's life, the effect that it has, the power that it has to change somebody from the inside out. And it also shows the resistance that grace gets from religious people. I mean, that's in this story also. We have to sort of picture the scene here. Some of you are familiar with the story and some of you, I'm sure, aren't. But you got to kind of picture the scene here. Jesus, these verses tell us, is making his way into Jericho, and he's mobbed. He'd become famous for his teaching and his healing, and so as word spread that he was coming their way, the citizens of Jericho rushed out to see him. They wanted to get a glimpse of this guy who in that region had become so well known. Word had spread that Jesus was going to be making his way through their town, and they wanted to see him. They wanted to see who this was. They wanted to interact with him, and so he was mobbed. In verse 2 and 3 of the verses that I read describe this man who also wanted to see Jesus. He made his way toward the mob, but because he was so short, he couldn't see Jesus, and so he climbed up a tree. And verse 2 says that he was a chief tax collector in that region, and that he was very wealthy, that he was rich. We don't like tax collectors these days, but they really didn't like tax collectors in those days. Whatever we may want to say about the fairness or unfairness of paying taxes, back then tax collectors were bona fide thieves. Bona fide thieves. They always charged people more than what was owed and then sort of lined their own pockets with extra money. They were professional thieves is what they were. And they were protected by the Roman government so that if you didn't pay what the tax collector told you to pay, then you would get in trouble legally and otherwise. Now, to get the full weight of who Zacchaeus was, you have to know that. You have to know just how despised and hated tax collectors were in those days. First of all, the rates were very vague and indefinite. Okay, there wasn't any kind of set rate, and so the collector was always taking more than what was owed because there was no real proof. You had to pay whatever he said you had to pay. There wasn't like this, list of the kinds of taxes you needed to pay. They didn't have tax brackets and all of that stuff back then. You just had to pay whatever the tax collector told you to pay. So whatever he told you could have been a lot more than what you actually owed, and he became rich. These tax collectors became rich. And Zacchaeus wasn't just the chief tax collector in Jericho, but for that entire region. So he was infamous. People didn't like him. He was not a popular guy. He didn't have a lot of friends. The tax collector represented the abusive power of Roman rule. Okay, the Roman rule during that time was oppressive, it was abusive, and tax collectors taking money from citizens to benefit Rome was just one more reminder to any and all citizens that Rome was in charge. It was one way they flexed their muscles. And if you were a Jew in those days, paying taxes to Caesar was considered an act of disloyalty to God. So It wasn't just that you were getting robbed, you were being asked to compromise your faith or die in their eyes. And if the tax collector was a Jew, like Zacchaeus, I mean, that's a double whammy. It made matters worse because they were seen as traitors by other Jews. How could you not only be serving this abusive Roman power, but you're also stealing from your fellow countrymen? I mean, they were looked at as traitors. They were working for the enemy. They were stealing from their own people. So they were despised. I mean, a tax collector was despised. A Jewish tax collector in a Jewish region, double despised. I mean, this guy, like I said, he had no friends. He was the most hated man in town for very understandable reasons. Had I lived in Jericho during that time, I would have hated Zacchaeus, and so would have you, okay? I mean, he was despised, which makes Jesus's actions here even more surprising, okay? The stage is set for Jesus to show that he loves all the wrong people, all the unpopular people, that he buddies up next to all of the wrong people, and he breaks all of the religious rules. Jesus is walking by, and he sees Zacchaeus up in the tree, and he singles him out, and he calls him down, and he announces, not just to Zacchaeus, but in front of everybody else, that he wants to go and stay at his house. Not, Zacchaeus, if you shape up, I'd be willing to spend some time with you. Not, Zacchaeus, if you clean up your act, I will grace your home with my presence. None of that. He just felt compelled. He said, Zacchaeus, come down. I must stay at your house. I must. He was compelled to be near to this man that everybody wanted to be far away from. Jesus was always running toward the people that everybody else was running away from. All the time. I mean, this is just so common. What made the religious fit-ins furious was Jesus's bad habit, his impolite habit of loving sinners. They hated that. In fact, they were convinced that he was an imposter because of that. I mean, no man of God worth his salt, no self-respecting man of God would ever associate with people like this, ever. He was always pissing off all the right people. He was always making the religious rule keepers mad because he befriended and loved and touched the outcast and the misfit and the leper and the liar and the cheater and the adulterer and the thief. Always. He was always cozying up to the wrong people in their eyes. It reminds me of that line I've shared before by Mike Yaconelli, where he said, Jesus, according to the religious leaders, Jesus did God all wrong. All wrong. It's like Jesus didn't go to school to learn how to be the right kind of God. And so he was just screwing it up, left and right, screwing it up. Of all the people, well, as you can see in verse 7, that this just scandalized the people. I mean, they were just flabbergasted. I mean, I love the line here in verse 7, but the people were displeased. This is what they said, he has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner. He's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, as if they themselves were not notorious sinners. That's really the issue. The problem here is not that they're calling Zacchaeus a notorious sinner and he's not. He was a real jerk, okay? A thief and a jerk. The problem here was that they didn't see themselves as notorious sinners. They thought they were better than this guy. Well, Jesus wants to make a point. He wants to make a very strong point that has a very strong effect. I mean, of all the people Jesus decides to befriend, he chooses the most hated man in the city, singles out the most despised man in the city, and with great joy and anticipation says, Zacchaeus, come down from there. I'm coming to your house. And of course, Zacchaeus is just like, I don't know the ins and outs of Zacchaeus' relational life, but based on what this says, we can be sure that he didn't have a lot of friends. How many people wanted to go to his house? I mean, the guy, if he didn't have a family, probably lived alone, ate alone. He just, the very idea that someone wanted to come over to his house because they wanted to was just like, he couldn't believe it. I mean, this was a guy who was touched by love and grace in a way that perhaps he never had been before. Now, if Jesus would have shunned Zacchaeus, or even better, called him out publicly, Jesus could have tripled his following that day. Okay, that would have been the popular move. If Jesus would have seen Zacchaeus up in the tree and said, Zacchaeus, you're a thief. You've stolen from everybody in this crowd. You need to make it right. Mend your ways. Come down here. I mean, we praise people who call the bad guys out publicly. Praise them. Like, yeah, man, call them out. Call them out. Lynch them. Jesus does the exact opposite. I mean, in the same way that this crowd was frustrated by the fact that Jesus didn't call him out and rebuke him publicly, we get frustrated when the bad people seem to sort of get what they don't deserve in terms of God's love and grace. Jesus would have gained the respect and loyalty of the mob had he called him out and confronted him in front of everybody. I mean, Jesus, literally, his approval rating would have gone through the roof. Not that he wasn't already a popular guy, but I mean, his approval rating would have literally gone through the roof had he done what these people expected him to do, or maybe even wanted him to do. But by befriending Zacchaeus, Jesus himself becomes the object of scorn. Okay, his popularity and approval rating plummet by doing this. And what's interesting is that the people's attention shifts from despising Zacchaeus to despising Jesus. In this sense, Jesus was his substitute. Took the scorn, took all of the despising and the scorn that they had previously channeled towards Zacchaeus, and now it's on Jesus. Does that remind you of something? Fast forward to the cross, he did the same thing for all of us. Exact same thing for all of us. So Jesus becomes very unpopular to these people. The mob, the crowd, they can't believe what they're seeing. I mean, he's really screwing it up. I mean, you have made the one decision that you shouldn't make if you want to be popular. He made it. He made the most unpopular decision that he could have possibly made in that moment. You know, you've heard me say this before, but grace isn't expensive, okay? It's not even cheap. It's free. It's a no-strings-attached gift of love. But to practice grace, to love the unlovable, to forgive the unforgivable, to stand with the guilty, to love sinners, well, that might actually cost you favor and friends. It might actually cost you your life, as it did in Jesus' case. I mean, yes, we celebrate and revel in the fact that grace is a no-strings-attached gift of one-way love, that it's free. It comes our way, minus our merit. But to practice grace, to stand with the person who is accused, to stand with the guilty, to love the unlovable, to forgive the unforgivable, that's seen as soft and overly tolerant. And doing that will cost you favor. It will cost you friends. I was canceled a handful of years ago. I love living in the world of being canceled because, as Janis Joplin said, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose, okay? So I actually look forward to the opportunity to stand with the people who have fallen. I love it. I love it because what are they going to say about me? I mean, what are they going to say? I mean, it is a joy. I mean, one of the sort of side ministries that I have, because my story is so public and out there, anytime a pastor or a leader crashes and burns, screws it up, falls, they call me. I don't know where a lot of them get my number, but they call me, or they message me, or they email me. I mean, I have heard story after story after story after story, and I'm telling you right now, if I was an independently wealthy man, okay, which I am not, but if I were, and I had millions of dollars just sitting in the bank, I would invite all of these defrocked pastors who screwed up their lives to come here and to just sort of rest. I would give them all a salary and say, I don't want you to have to worry about finding a job. You need time to heal. You need time to recover. You need time to get mentally, emotionally, and spiritually healthy. And I don't want you to have to worry about going out and getting a job. Just come. I would do that in a heartbeat. I would love to do that. So if any of you guys are independently wealthy and you want to contribute to the Fallen Pastors Fund, Scholarship Fund, come see me after church. I would love. I really would. It would be awesome. And we would get, I mean, the religious people would hate us for it. And I love that. So punk rock, and I dig it. So there is something so, you can tell, this is why I resonate with this story so much. I mean, Jesus just does the wrong thing in the eyes of the good people, the religious people. See, the truth is, God's grace tends to annoy us the same way it annoyed them. If we're honest, I mean, we want God to hold a grudge against the same people we do, but he won't. We want him to be kind only to those who we think deserve it, but he's not. It's a little uncomfortable to know and to believe that God loves the person you hate. Loves them. And all this talk about grace and Zacchaeus and love and it's all great. Until we see God giving that same love and that same grace to someone who really hurt us. I mean, I know what that tension feels like. I mean, there are a whole host of people that I want God to hate. And he won't. And that bothers me sometimes, you know? I mean, I don't want to see people who have hurt me succeed in life. I don't want that. I mean, to be quite honest, I don't. I want them to crash and burn. And yet God just thankfully doesn't play by our rules. If he did, we'd all be in trouble. The one thing that irritates people the most, and I include myself in this, the one thing that irritates people the most about God is his willingness to love, forgive, and restore those whom we've decided deserve the exact opposite. There is something about grace and forgiveness that offends everyone except the person who needs it. Think about that. I mean, there is something about grace and forgiveness that offends everyone except the person who needs it. The truth is, we tend to be a lot more like the crowd surrounding Zacchaeus than we may want to admit. But thankfully, Jesus didn't care what the crowd thought, and he especially didn't care what the religious crowd thought. They had it all wrong. They were all about being clean and being right and moral resumes and spiritual prowess and those sorts of things. The religious leaders in particular were convinced, as I said before, that Jesus was an imposter because God would never embrace bad, sinful, dirty people like this, ever. But Jesus was on a mission to love the worst of the worst, and the baddest of the bad, and the guiltiest of the guilty. Jesus loving and embracing the victim, the one who is not guilty, that's not scandalous. That's expected. We even do that. What is scandalous is that Jesus loved the guilty, the offender. That's scandalous. That's what scandalized them, and that's typically what scandalizes us. And in so doing, in loving the guilty, the offender, in so doing, Jesus was showing that God doesn't operate the way we do. God's kingdom is all about God giving and us receiving, not us accomplishing and God applauding. His kingdom is upside down in all of the right ways. All of the right ways. God's economy is very different than ours. One of my favorite passages in the Gospels is Mark chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. And it says this: when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw Jesus eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" They were confounded by this, confused. On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now, you've heard me explain this before. Sometimes people will read those verses or verses like those and say, okay, there are two kinds of people in this world. There are righteous people who don't need God, and then there are sinful people who do need God. And what Jesus is saying here is, I haven't come for the righteous people because they don't need me. I've come for the unrighteous people, the sinners, because they do. But that's not what he's saying. He's essentially saying there are two kinds of people in this world. There are unrighteous people who know that they're unrighteous, and there are unrighteous people who think that they're righteous. The unrighteous people who think that they're righteous, they'll never listen to a word I say because they don't think they need me. They think they're good enough, they think they're strong enough, and they definitely think they're better than those people. So they're not going to listen. They're not going to pay any attention. I had a mentor a number of years ago, Paul Zoll, who some of you have met. He was here for Fallen and Free, who said to me, and I'm not sure exactly where he got it, but he said, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And his point was, until you're ready to learn and listen and hear, everything's going to fall on deaf ears. That's great parenting advice, by the way. We try to force feed our kids to become a certain way. And if they're not ready for it, sometimes, sadly, I'm a dad, so I've experienced this, kids just have to sort of experience the consequences of life without God before they recognize their need for him. Okay, I get that. Well, Jesus is saying here, I haven't come for the people who think they're okay without me. I've come for the people who know that they're not okay without me. So this was very, very confusing. Okay, it's confusing today, but it was super confusing back then. This idea that this holy, good, righteous God who spoke all things into existence and created us and made us and is perfect would ever associate with imperfection, unlovely people, bad, guilty people, perpetrators, not just victims, but perpetrators. Okay, the offender, not just the offended. I mean, this was very, very confusing. I watched a clip yesterday. I couldn't believe what I was watching. It was a guy who walked into, and he brought someone with him, so there was somebody filming this. A guy who walked into Joel Osteen's church in Houston. Okay, now Joel Osteen, I understand, can be somewhat controversial in some ways. He's a really nice guy. I've met him a handful of times. He's a super nice guy. He really has a great smile, okay? But this guy walks into his church in the lobby and starts rebuking Joel Osteen. You're not preaching the gospel, blah, blah, blah. This isn't a church. I mean, he's just going off. And he's very proud of himself because he's got his buddy filming this whole thing. And then he puts it on social media so that he'll be seen as this martyr for truth. And then, of course, when the security comes and sort of, his buddy is still filming and the security comes. And, of course, now he's a martyr. He's a victim. I'm just speaking the truth. This is the price you pay when all you do is speak the truth, okay? I mean, the pomposity of this idiot was driving me nuts. I was becoming very self-righteous about this guy's self-righteousness. But I thought to myself, in all seriousness, that doesn't work, dude. It just doesn't. Like, well, what do you think? Joel Osteen's going to all of a sudden go, thank you for barging in here and screaming on the top of your lungs, now I see, thank you. Like, that's not the way change happens. And Jesus proves that in this story. He could have done that. He could have done the exact same thing this dude was doing to Zacchaeus in front of everybody. Could have done it. But he did the really unpopular thing. He did the one thing that these people couldn't understand and certainly didn't like. When Jesus says in Mark 2 that it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick, I love that. It tells us something so different about God, that it's our sickness and our weaknesses that attracts him. Not our health, not our strength, not our goodnesses. It's our sickness, our badness, our weaknesses that attracts him, that summons him. As crazy as this sounds, but the arrival of Jesus as a baby born in a manger is proof of this, that it's our sin that summons God. I mean, if we didn't need him, he wouldn't come. We needed him, even though we didn't know we needed him, and he came. It was our sickness. It was our sin. It was our badness that caused the second person of the Trinity to take on human flesh and frailty and become one of us. You know, I've heard this almost my whole life, that the goal of the Christian life is to become like Jesus. Not true. Good luck with that anyway. I mean, the foundation of the Christian faith is that Jesus became like us. That's the good news. That's the mind-blowing, counterintuitive good news. It's our sickness and our weakness that attracts God. The next part is my favorite part of the story. Jesus' extension of grace totally changes Zacchaeus. Totally changes him. He goes to his house. Zacchaeus comes out of the tree. They walk together to Zacchaeus' house. The crowd is bickering and complaining that this whole thing is happening. And they get to Zacchaeus' house, and, now that he has Zacchaeus in private, you'd expect him to say, now, Zacchaeus, I didn't want to embarrass you publicly, but dude, you got to change. I mean, you are a greedy thief, and you've got to make things right. I mean, listen, I have enough tact to not sort of lynch you in front of everybody, but now that we're in private, in the confines of your own home, I got some stuff to tell you, dude. Like, you got to freaking fix stuff. I mean, you're a real jerk, and everything they say about you is true. You need to fix this. He doesn't confront him. He doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't do any of that stuff. He just eats with him and talks with him. He just loves him. And look what happens. Look what happens. Verse 8. Not because Jesus told him this, just because he was on the receiving end of this unconditional love. It says, meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before Jesus and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. Now, there's nothing even in the Old Testament law that requires that. Nothing. And if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. Nothing in the Old Testament law that demands that either. And he wasn't told to do it. He just did it because he wanted to. He was loved, and he, as a result, wanted to make things right, wanted to love in return. One of the reasons that I love that is because it gives us a real, I think, picture of how change actually happens in a person. Okay, how does change, what actually affects change in the human heart? I mean, Jesus doesn't correct him, he doesn't rebuke him, he doesn't force, coerce, or guilt Zacchaeus into giving back what he stole. He just loves him, and the natural fruit of this love turns out to be a deep desire to love in return, to give. And so this really does get to the heart of the question: how does real change happen in a person? Any person. How has real change happened in your life? How has real change happened in my life? There's this common misunderstanding that grace and change don't go hand in hand, that they're enemies. People think love and grace are too soft to affect real change in someone. Guilt, fear, rebuke, correction. That's the stuff that changes the human heart. Not love and grace and mercy, you softy. That's not what does it. You love people once they have changed so that they will be encouraged to change more, but you don't love them on the front end of change. You love them on the back end of change. That's the way we typically operate, even in our relationships. Too much love and grace make people complacent, they say, and it produces bad behavior. Fear and guilt changes people, not grace and mercy. That's not what actually changes people. But what we see here and in our lives is that love is the essence of any lasting transformation that takes place in human experience. When we are loved, especially when we know we don't deserve it, we're moved. It changes us. It marks us. It often softens us. Love changes people. It really changes people. Rebukes and correction and consequences, they all have their place. Don't get me wrong. Okay, I've learned a lot of things from a lot of people as a result of rebuke and correction and consequences. I get all that. All of those things are under the realm of law, which is good and helpful in exposing our needs, in exposing our imperfections. The best thing a rebuke can do is expose to the person you're rebuking that they need to change, but it doesn't actually do the changing work. Something else needs to happen in addition to that, after that affects real change in a person. So if you think that just telling people they need to change is what actually changes them, you're going to find yourself very frustrated in your relationships to other people, because you'll think to yourself, well, all they need to know is that they're blind. They got all these blind spots. They need to know that they have to change. So all I have to do is tell them, point out their blind spots and tell them they need to change. And while that may be necessary and helpful in showing the person their need for change, that's not what changes the human heart. That's not what does it. When we are loved, especially when we don't deserve it, in the face of failure, it marks us. It changes us. Those things, like I said, rebukes and correction and those things, they have their place, but it's love that ultimately changes the heart. Think about it. Behind your biggest life-changing moments, I would guess, inevitably lies some instance of being loved when you deserved judgment. I could give you story after story after story about my own dad in this regard. Moments, episodes in my life, especially as a late teenager into my early 20s, episode after episode after episode where I deserved judgment. And my dad loved me instead. And that's always a little scary for the person who's doing the loving, because you may not see a return on that investment right away. The person may take advantage of it. The person may abuse it. But the seeds of grace and love always come to fruition down the road. My friend Steve Brown says, when he's talking to parents, he says, kids will run from the law and they'll run from love. But the ones who run from love will always come back. The ones who run from the law rarely come back. So the fruit of grace is always in the future. Now, we have episodes like this one where it seems to be immediate, and that's always so encouraging when that happens, but there's no guarantee that it will. But I could give you story after story after story of my own dad, who was the embodiment of grace. Two people who were really the embodiment of grace. I had a lot of people in my life give me grace, a lot, thankfully. But my dad and my grandmother on my mom's side, those were like, they're two of the faces on my personal Mount Rushmore. I mean, they were just the embodiment of grace to me. And their love for me in moments, especially in moments when I didn't deserve it, marked me. I mean, I'm 50 years old. I'm still talking about it. They're still etched in my memory. They're tattooed on my heart, those things. When we are loved and we don't deserve it, it changes us. I mean, the people who have changed me the most are the people who have never tried to change me. That's the irony. They just loved me. And I would suspect that that's probably true for you too, if you really thought about it deeply. That the people who have changed you the most are the people who just loved you, not the people who are always trying to change you. Have you ever been around someone who is always trying to change you? I mean, you can't get away fast enough. You can't. I mean, I've seen marriage after marriage after marriage in my years of pastoral counsel fall apart because out of frustration that she couldn't change him and he couldn't change her. And their mission, apparently, was to make the other one more like them. And nobody likes being around someone who's constantly trying to change them. No one. That kind of stuff creates division. Become more like this. You need to become more like this. I mean, we don't fall in love with people who say, love me better. We fall in love with people who say, I love you no matter what. There are no words that awaken life in the heart more than the words, I love you. I love you. No words. What this story proves is that gratitude and generosity and honesty and compassion and acts of mercy and all of that stuff, those things spring unsummoned from the one who hears God say, I love you no matter what. I mean, that's why I always get a little annoyed when people talk about the fact that, well, if you talk about God's grace and God's love and God's forgiveness so much, it's, serial killers are going to be developed. People are not going to care anymore about doing the right thing. And I'm like, man, you show me one person who has been so gripped by God's love for them and God's forgiveness of them that it makes them want to go out and kill people. Okay, you feel guilty about your desire to want to go out and kill people, like I feel right now as a result of driving here this morning and the person in the Altima who didn't recognize that the speed limit on Indiantown Road was not 25. Anyway, so I mean, when we're loved, it makes us want to love. I mean, it does. You know this in your relationships too. When you have a spouse or a child or a friend or somebody, a boyfriend or a girlfriend who just is so kind and compassionate and loving, doesn't it? I mean, it makes me want to love that person more, not less. Well, let me just conclude with this, that what Jesus did with Zacchaeus, he does with all of us. He picks us out of the crowd and insists on being in a relationship with us, not because we deserved it, but because we didn't deserve it. It's big. Okay? He singles us out and he insists on being in a relationship with us, not because we deserve it, but because we didn't deserve it. And it is his love, not his law, which softens our hard hearts. It is a relationship with him, not rules from him, that produces intimacy. Now, don't hear me wrong. The law is good because it exposes our need. But the law in and of itself, the rules, the law, all that kind of stuff, the standard of perfection, all of those kinds of things, all that has the power to do is expose our imperfection. It doesn't have the power to actually change us, soften us. That's who Jesus is, not only in this story, but in our lives and in all of the stories. He's the God who gives and gives, who turns the other cheek, who endures our sense of entitlement. who absorbs our rebellion, and he forgives our failures until our hearts melt under the heat of his love. That's who he is.